The Tudor palace did not smell of incense or triumph, it breathed like a wounded thing. Heavy tapestries trapping the sour warmth of the winter fires, rushes steeped in wine and ash, the sweetish taint of ointments, vinegar, and old blood. Beneath coloured glass that broke daylight into jewels, the air itself felt bruised. Courtiers learned to read it the way sailors read a sky. They could tell if the king had slept by the flavour of the corridors, if the morning was safe by the sting of camphor, if danger stalked them by the sudden drift of musk, meant to drown another odour. The body of a monarch was supposed to be a miracle. Here it was a map of defeat. He had once moved like a hunt broad-shouldered laughter, a stride that devoured corridors, a hand that could snap a lance from the rack and make it sing in an instant. Now he came like a procession forced to its knees, bandages blooming through silk, a cane that thudded like a small drum of war attendants pacing close enough to catch him if he lurched. The ulcers on his legs were the kingdom's worst-kept secret. They hid in linen, in poultices, in prayers, in the way servants were taught to keep their eyes a respectful fracture lower than the hem of the royal coat. Each dressing left a constellation of stains on cloth that no laundress could fully conquer. Each step required calibration pain first, then breath, then dignity. Power did not recede with the body. It thickened. It congealed in the silence that followed the king's wheeze, in the way lords swallowed a cough, rather than break his rhythm in the way no one dared open a window when the air grew rancid. To reign in England was to command weather-coin men and memory. To reign like this required an additional miracle. The court had to agree not to notice what their eyes could not avoid. And so an entire world learned to act as though the king's flesh had not turned traitor. They praised his hunting gear even as he could not hunt. They celebrated his prowess at night even as witnesses waited beyond the bedchamber door to vouch for what had not happened. They performed reverence until reverence became another kind of lie. In the middle of this theatre stepped a woman who, according to the later histories, was lucky. Anne of Cleves did not share the fate of Anne Boleyn, whose quicksilver wit could not outrun steel. She did not bleed quietly into banishment like Catherine of Aragon, exiled for the sin of growing older while remaining faithful. She did not die of childbed devotion like Jane Seymour. Anne lived. She kept her head. In the arithmetic of Tudor queenship that should have been triumph. But luck in this world arrived with a bitter aftertaste. It asked for a price that did not show up in the ledgers, only in the posture of a woman at table. In the way laughter paused when she entered a room, in the perfect English unwanted, she never truly mastered. And the jokes that turned on words she had not learned. Survival can be a crown when all other crowns are barbed. It can also be a brand burned into the softest part of the self, the story others decide to tell about you when you have no breath left to protest. In the palace where even the air wore a mask, Anne's fortune meant being transformed into a moral and emblem of error, a living correction, the queen who was spared because she was unworthy. The truth was crueler and simpler. Anne had been delivered to England in the wrapping of policy, painted into acceptability by a master's hand, her name pressed like a seal into a letter that crossed a hostile sea. She arrived to a scent she could not have imagined to a husband she had not yet seen, except as a polished portrait, and an idea to a court that believed it knew her before she crossed the threshold. Henry VIII, once the radiant centre of his own cosmos, had become both gravity and swamp. Men orbited and sank. Women were summoned into his weather, and measured by whether they could make him forget the barometer in his bones. When Anne did not ignite the room the way his pride demanded, the atmosphere of failure attached to her like a cloak. What is the smell behind the tapestries? Not only the unclean wounds of a king who once leapt into saddles, it is the odour of concealment. The court's perfumes did not simply aim to console a body in pain, they laboured to fog the mind. There was a law in the palace more absolute than any statute stamped with wax. No one would speak the one truth that could puncture the myth, that desire is a creature of nerves and memory and health, and that sometimes a monarch's loins like any man's answer to the calendar of suffering. It was safer to declare a wife unsatisfactory than to admit weakness that could ripple beyond bedchamber and altar to throne and treaty. Anne walked these corridors under eyes that never blinked. She was not trained for this kind of attention. In Cleves, virtue had worn plain cloth and spoken softly. In London, virtue was another kind of costume, and silence could be a trap. She was accustomed to rooms where the most complicated music was the hum of prayer and winter wind to women who prized order and piety over charming a hall of poets. Here the world thought in masks, in dance steps, in the precise angle of a hand extended or withheld. Misunderstandings in such a world were not trivial. They were verdicts. the courtiers veterans of a decade of marriages and annulments, heads that had rolled and heads that had dodged, had learned to live by the draught of royal favour. Some wore that knowledge like armour, others like a fever. They tasted the gusts the way hounds taste ground head down, alert to the thin scent of danger. A new queen was a new climate, potentially, a new religion, certainly, a new geography of patronage. But this queen arrived as an omen. The air itself seemed to sour when Henry's eyes went flat. The same portraits that had once promised salvation now looked like evidence. Men who had argued for the match began to speak in clauses with escape hatches. Women who might have offered counsel measured the risk of gentleness and found it fatal. It is easy from our distance to laugh at the superstition of a court that thought a marriage could stabilise a continent. Yet when the king's body faltered, treaties wobbled too. The wound that would not heal on his leg echoed through the state every delay, every sudden whim, every mood that unmade policy because the pain underneath was bigger than the sap. In the Tudor machine, the private was public, and the public was a theatre where the audience was also the cast. The final scandal was not that Henry's flesh weakened him, it was that each person in his orbit had to agree to say otherwise aloud. Anne learned quickly the grammar of this denial. She smiled when required, and the smile was counted. She stood for hours, and her quiet was tallied. She sat to dine, and the angle at which she lifted bread to her mouth became a small trial she could pass or fail. The Queen's body had always been evidence of alliances, of fertility, of fidelity. Now it also served as a screen onto which the King's failure could be projected and judged without naming its source. The whispers named her cold, clumsy, unripe. They spoke of scents and shapes. They unspooled a litany of defects that protected a single person from the one word that could make kingdoms flinch: impotence. But this is not a tale of a fool led blindfolded to the stage. Anne, who had been taught order and thrift and the virtues of endurance, understood at once that survival would be a craft. She could not conjure desire in a body that feared itself. She could, however, choose what not to fight. In a court that made theatre of everything, refusal could be fatal improvisation. Consent, carefully given, strategically framed, could open a margin of safety. The smell behind the tapestries was not defeat alone. It was also a warning bell, a call to fashion, a life inside a system that devoured the unguarded. So we begin not with the romance of a ship and a portrait, but with the weight of air. We begin in chambers where the floor creaks under silenced truths, where the king's breath is counted as though it were a tax, where the softest step can draw the sharpest eye. We begin where survival does not resemble victory, where mercy wears the face of mockery, where a woman will later be called fortunate for discovering that peace can sometimes be bought only with the coin of humiliation. We begin with a thesis that makes the stomach turn and the mind sharpen. The worst stench in the palace was never the wound. It was the habit of power that insisted the wound was perfume. Anne of Cleves will outlive the king who despised her, the girls who danced in his gaze, the men who bet their futures on his favour. She will die in her bed in a house whose doors she learned to close against the draught. But if we call that luck, we must count its cost from the start. To stay alive here is to become a story that other people tell. To be spared is to endure being defined. In rooms where truth was always dressed before it was allowed to appear, Anne's first lesson was that dignity might not look like triumph at all. It might look like breathtaking quietly while the court holds its nose and swears the air is sweet. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? From Europe in the 1530s was a furnace. Fire flared not only from the mouths of cannons, but also from pulpits, from printing presses, from the rumours that travelled along roads as quickly as armies. To the east and south stretched the vast dominions of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Spain, Naples, Burgundy, and a scattering of territories so wide that his officials claimed the sun never set on his lands. To the west brooded France, the Valois kings who had spent centuries trading blows with England across the Channel, and who still dreamed of swallowing the duchies and towns that straddled their border with the empire. Between these titans, smaller states lived like villages, near a battlefield, clutching their treaties like shields, changing sides when survival demanded it. And at the centre of the web, though not at the centre of power, sat Rome. The papacy remained the arbiter of legitimacy. A bull from the Pope could still unmake a king's marriage, sanctify a war, or brand a prince heretic. The Church's influence was not only spiritual, it was financial and political, a vast bureaucracy tied to every crown by marriages, dispensations, tithes and indulgences. To be cut off from Rome was to be cut off from the network that bound Europe together. It was to stand outside the orchestra while the music of legitimacy continued to play. Henry VIII had made precisely that gamble. In his hunger for a son and an heir, he had ripped England out of the papal fold, an act that astonished even his allies. He had not merely divorced Catherine of Aragon, he had divorced the entire Catholic world. Catherine's nephew was Charles V himself, the most powerful monarch in Christendom whose armies could at any moment descend on English shores. By discarding her, Henry not only insulted her family, but also made England a pariah in the eyes of much of Catholic Europe. The break with Rome was as much a geopolitical suicide note as it was a love letter to Anne Boleyn. England was wealthy, yes, its wool-fueled continental markets, its ships were beginning to probe the edges of the Atlantic world. But it was also small, perched on the edge of Europe like a stone in a storm tide. Without allies, it risked being swept away by Habsburg or Valois wrath. The Pope had tools sharper than swords. He could excommunicate a ruler, absolve subjects of loyalty, even invite invasion under the banner of holy war. For Henry, isolated by his own choices, the crown suddenly sat on a cliff edge. Every rebellion at home, every mutter of discontent in the shires, could be nourished by foreign gold. The Reformation, which elsewhere was tearing through Germany and Switzerland, offered Henry both danger and opportunity. Lutheran princes of the Holy Roman Empire had begun to unite in leagues against the emperor, raising banners of faith and defiance. They sought protection, recognition, and trade partners. They sought legitimacy for their resistance against Rome. Henry, though never truly a Protestant in theology, saw in them a chance to stitch together the alliances he had lost. To clasp the hand of a Protestant duchy was to send a message across Europe. England was not alone. It had brothers in rebellion, and its throne was not a candle waiting for the papal wind to snuff it out. Marriage became the most eloquent language of diplomacy. A wife could bring dowry armies and a shift in the balance of power with a single vow. In this calculus, Henry's queens were more than women. They were treaties wrapped in fiche. Catherine of Aragon had bound him to Spain. Anne Boleyn symbolised defiance of Rome. Jane Seymour offered reconciliation with conservative factions at home. Now, with enemies circling and Catholic Europe hostile, he needed a new cipher, a new bridge. That bridge would not come from France, still too dangerous, nor from Spain, still too insulted, nor from Rome, which he had shattered. It had to come from the Protestant heart of the empire, from princes who shared his rebellion against papal chains. Thus Anne of Cleves entered the ledger before she ever entered the kingdom. Her brother Duke Wilhelm of Cleves was aligned with the Schmalkaldic League of Protestant states. His land sat at a crossroads strategically close to the Low Countries on the Rhine, with eyes toward both France and the Empire. An alliance with Cleves would not transform England into a superpower, but it would plant the Tudor banner inside the Protestant camp and tell Charles V that England could not be isolated without risk. It was in essence a marriage designed as a shield, but shields forged in haste can become brittle. The match was conceived less from desire than from fear, less from romance than from arithmetic. It was born in the corridors of diplomacy and Cromwell's calculations, in the anxieties of a king whose body was failing and whose enemies could smell the blood. For Henry, every new treaty was also an attempt to deny time to prove that he still commanded Europe's respect. For Cromwell, the architect of this gamble, Anne represented the last chance to secure the Protestant flank before Catholic daggers closed in. England in these years was like a ship sailing between storm's masts, groaning, crew exhausted, captain wounded, with every decision a wager between shipwreck and survival. The break with Rome had cast it adrift. The marriage with Anne of Cleves was the anchor Henry hoped might steady it in a sea of shifting alliances. Yet, as with all anchors once dropped, it could also trap the ship in a perilous place. Thomas Cromwell was not born into the marble world he came to command. He was the son of a Putney blacksmith, a boy who once crossed the Channel with nothing but his wits and a willingness to fight. In Italy he learned the language of merchants and mercenaries. In the Low Countries he learned the subtler weapons of banking and law. When he returned to England, he carried no noble crest, only an arsenal of experience that would prove more lethal than any sword. It was Cromwell who had steered Henry through the break with Rome, crafted the acts that declared the king supreme head of the church, and stripped the monasteries of their wealth to fatten the crown. His genius was not in war but in administration, turning parchment into power, ink into coin signatures, into weapons sharper than pikes. By the late 1530s, Cromwell knew his master's throne was surrounded by storm clouds. Spain and the Empire under Charles V seethed at Catherine of Aragon's humiliation. France, restless and opportunistic, watched for weakness. The Pope still wielded the thunderbolt of excommunication. Even at home, rebellion had already risen in the north. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 had shown how quickly piety and anger could ignite a kingdom. Isolation was no longer a theoretical risk. It was a fact pressing on England like a tightening vice. The solution, Cromwell believed, lay not in reconciliation with Catholic powers, but in a decisive turn toward Protestant allies. Germany was the heart of that movement, the Schmalkaldic League of Lutheran princes, fragile yet fierce. In their defiance of Charles V needed England's friendship as much as England needed theirs. Among these Protestant rulers, one duchy in particular glimmered as an opportunity: Cleves. On the map, Cleves looked modest, tucked between the Rhine and the marches of Flanders. It could not boast vast armies or sprawling lands, but geography is often more valuable than size. Cleves sat at the crossroads of Europe's fiercest contests, near the trade arteries of the Low Countries and the vulnerable borderlands where France and the Empire rubbed raw against each other. Whoever held Cleves could tilt the balance between Charles V's Habsburg possessions in the Netherlands and the Protestant strongholds of Germany. For Cromwell, aligning Henry with Cleves was not just marriage, it was a declaration that England stood with the New World struggling to be born out of Luther's fire. Duke Wilhelm of Cleves. Anne's brother had already raised his banner with the Protestants. His duchy was a hinge in the Holy Roman Empire, modest in resources, but immense in symbolic weight. To unite Henry with Wilhelm's sister would be to announce that England had planted itself inside the Protestant coalition, forcing Charles V to think twice before treating Henry as a solitary renegade. It was less about armies than about signalling one queen's hand could mean the difference between being a heretic king or a partner in a new European order. Cromwell understood the danger. This was not a match calculated to charm Henry's vanity. Anne of Cleves was no French princess schooled in courtly arts, no Italian prodigy of music and wit. She was by the standards of English courtiers provincial. But for Cromwell, the marriage was never about lace or lute playing. It was about survival England's and his own. He had bet everything on the Protestant cause. The dissolution of the monasteries had made him enemies among the old nobility. His reforms had destabilized centuries of custom. Only a solid Protestant alliance could secure the kingdom and shield him from aristocratic knives eager to see the blacksmith's son fall. To gamble on Cleves was to gamble on the future. Cromwell staked his reputation that the marriage would cement Henry's place among the reformers and secure England a partner in the heart of Europe. He persuaded, flattered, and argued until the king allowed Hans Holbein to travel across the sea with his brushes. He made promises to foreign envoys and swore that this alliance would be the keystone of England's survival. He was not blind to the risks, but the alternatives were worse. Reconciliation with Charles V meant bowing to Rome. A French match meant tethering England to an old enemy. Only Cleves offered independence and insurance. Yet in the Tudor court, every gamble was played on a stage where personal desire could outweigh political necessity. Cromwell knew Henry's insecurities, his aging body, his hunger for admiration, his terror of impotence, but he hoped that duty and fear would bind the king to his plan. It was a desperate calculation born of a man who had risen too far to afford a single mistake. And in choosing Cleves, Cromwell tethered his fate to that of a woman he had never met, trusting that the map would speak louder than the mirror. History would show how perilous that trust was. For in a court ruled by the body of one man, even the sharpest strategies could be unmade by a single glance, a single breath, a single disappointment whispered in the wrong chamber. And Thomas Cromwell, the architect of England's survival, was about to discover that his greatest creation might also be his ruin. Anne of Cleves was not fashioned in the same furnace that had forged Henry's other wives. She came from the Duchy of Cleves, a principality where court life lacked the gilded theatrics of England or France. In Dusseldorf, where she spent much of her girlhood, there were no endless masques dripping with allegory, no nightly revels punctuated by madrigals, no corridors haunted by poets vying for a queen's smile. The court of her father, Duke Johann III, prized order, piety, and governance. It was sober Lutheran-leaning in spirit even before the Reformation fully took root. For Anne, a noble daughter's education was not meant to prepare her to dazzle but to endure. Her mother, Maria of Jülichberg, believed more in discipline than display. Anne was taught needlework, household management, and the moral gravity of obedience. She grew up among women who measured virtue not in wit but in silence, not in flirtation but in modesty, while Italian princesses trained their fingers across harpsichords and French queens to be mastered elegant steps of dance. Anne learned how to keep ledgers of estates, how to order a kitchen, how to maintain dignity and stillness. Her world was defined by seasons of fasting and feasting, by Lutheran sermons that warned against vanity, by corridors that rang with scripture more than lute strings. Languages themselves drew a border around her. Anne spoke the dialects of her homeland, but had little Latin, the universal key of European courts. She did not learn French, the language of diplomacy, nor English, the language of her destiny. At best, she had fragments of Dutch enough to trade words with neighbours along the Rhine. In a Europe where noble women were expected to glide between tongues as easily as they glided across marble floors, Anne was left with a voice that could not easily reach across borders. What she carried instead was a reputation for chastity, docility and faith, the very qualities Cromwell believed would make her unsaleable. It was a preparation suited for Cleves, but disastrously mismatched for London. Henry's court was a theatre without curtains, a world where survival depended on performance. Their women were expected to charm with dance, to answer wit with sharper wit, to be both ornament and confidant, partner and spectacle. Masks painted in gold and allegory demanded queens who could embody Venus one night, Minerva the next. Courtiers measured rank not just in blood, but in the elegance of a bow, the poetry one could recite, the songs one could accompany on the virginals. In this universe, silence was not virtue, it was failure to play one's part. Henry himself, even in decline, still demanded a court that revolved around his appetite for music and pageantry. He had grown up steeped in chivalric romances, in tournaments and love lyrics, in the pageantry of Arthurian ideals. To him, a queen was not merely a womb or an ally. She was supposed to be a living mask, beautiful, cultured, able to dazzle guests with her learning, and to soothe his insecurities with flattery. Even Catherine of Aragon, though Spanish by birth, had mastered Latin and French, and could parry courtiers with her intelligence. Anne Boleyn had enchanted him with French sophistication and musical talents. Jane Seymour had soothed him with quiet grace. Against this backdrop, Anne of Cleves seemed carved from another world entirely. The paradox was cruel. The very qualities that made Anne desirable to Cromwell, the impression of Lutheran modesty, the lack of entanglement with Catholic luxury, were the same qualities that doomed her to Henry's disdain. She embodied the sober dignity of her homeland, but in England that dignity read as awkwardness, her modest smile mistaken for coldness, her silence mistaken for dullness. Where others pirouetted through conversation, Anne stood still, and in stillness the court projected onto her whatever it pleased. It is tempting centuries later to imagine her as naive, stumbling into a labyrinth whose rules she could not guess. Yet there was strength in her simplicity. Anne carried into England a kind of incorruptibility. She did not know how to scheme in sonnets or bargain in riddles. She knew how to endure, how to keep her head low while storms passed. That, ironically, would be the skill that saved her life. But in the first days of her arrival, it made her seem like a ghost at a feast, a woman raised for silence in a kingdom where every silence was suspect. Foreshadowed in this clash of cultures is the tragedy to come, a king trained to expect theatre, and a queen trained to survive without speaking. When they finally met, the collision was inevitable. What Cromwell saw as a political union, Henry would perceive as a personal humiliation. And Anne, who had been raised to obey, would soon discover that silence in England could become a noose of its own. Hans Holbein the Younger had painted kings and courtiers before, but never had a single canvas carried so much weight. When Thomas Cromwell sent him to Cleves, it was not as an artist, it was as a diplomat with brushes instead of treaties. His task was to capture Anne in a way that would speak across borders, to translate her sober German presence into an image that could survive the scrutiny of Henry VIII, a man whose appetite for women was inseparable from his appetite for power. Holbein's reputation preceded him. He had already immortalized the grandeur of Henry himself, portraying the king as a colossus, legs planted, wide eyes commanding. Those who saw the portrait gasped. It was not a likeness, but an argument, a declaration of what a monarch wished to be. Holbein knew better than anyone that painting in the 16th century was less about truth and more about diplomacy. Portraits were not mirrors, they were masks designed to be worn across continents. When he arrived in Dusseldorf, Holbein set to work with the precision of a craftsman who understood both pigments and politics. He painted Anne with downcast eyes, her hands folded in perfect modesty. Her features were rendered with clarity, the lines precise, the skin luminous. No extravagant jewellery, no elaborate backdrop, just a composed young woman framed by restraint. To an English court reeling from candle and lust, such serenity looked like salvation. Here was no temptress like Anne Boleyn, no aging widow like Catherine of Aragon. Here was purity captured in oil, a figure whose very plainness could be mistaken for virtue. But what did likeness mean in this age? Sitters often expected painters to soften imperfections to emphasize dignity over detail. A portrait was meant to persuade, not to chronicle. A mole could vanish with a brushstroke, a line softened, a complexion brightened. For a woman destined to marry a king, a portrait was as much a contract as a face. When Henry studied Holbein's canvas in his palace, he was not simply admiring art, he was deciding policy, believing he had glimpsed the embodiment of alliance. This was the first trap. Did Holbein deceive? Most accounts suggest the painter was faithful, even restrained. Diplomats who later met Anne confirmed she resembled the image, though without the glow of canvas and composition. Perhaps it was not Holbein who erred, but Henry who read the portrait through the lens of his own need. He wanted to see grace and chastity. He wanted reassurance that his gamble on Cleves would not mock him. The canvas, like a mirror clouded with desire, reflected not just Anne's features, but the king's desperation. It is important to imagine the scene: Henry standing before the painting, his body swollen with age ulcers hidden beneath silks, mind already haunted by his fading virility. Before him on polished oak, a serene young woman gazed downward, modest and still. In that face Henry thought he saw rescue, not just from isolation but from himself. If Anne could embody simplicity, maybe she could steady as chaos. If she could be as calm as her painted hands, maybe she could silence the storm of Europe. But portraits cannot breathe, cannot disappoint, cannot misstep in etiquette. Anne, living flesh, would soon reveal what no artist could: control the cadence of her voice, the weight of her silence, the stiffness of her bearing. A portrait was eternal grace. A woman was human, bound by culture, tongue and chance. The chasm between paint and person would widen into humiliation. And so the question lingers like a riddle, whispered across centuries. Did Holbein flatter his subject, smoothing her into something she was not? Or did Henry, peering at oil and pigment, misread the very honesty before him, seeing not Anne but the echo of what he craved to believe? In that fragile space between art and expectation, a kingdom's fate was sealed. A canvas became treaty and brushstrokes became shackles. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. The winter wind off the North Sea was a cruel herald. In December 1539, Anne of Cleves boarded the ships that would carry her from the quiet banks of the Rhine toward the most perilous stage in Europe. She had never seen England, never heard its language, never felt the pull of its tides. What she knew was duty, her brother's orders, her mother's prayers, Cromwell's assurances that this journey would make her queen. Behind her lay the modest Lutheran sobriety of Dusseldorf. Ahead, an island where rumour said queens lived and died by the king's moods. The voyage itself was no trivial passage. Tudor ships were lumbering fortresses, their timbers groaning against waves, their decks awash with brine. Chroniclers tell us that storms plagued the crossing. More than once Anne's fleet had to seek harbour along the Low Countries, waiting for calmer seas. In those days a crossing was not merely travel, it was trial by water, a test of endurance where seasickness, damp clothing and fear mingled in the cramped cabins. For a young woman raised in landlocked courts, the sea must have felt like an endless shifting floor, each swell a reminder that her life was already unmoored. And yet she endured it with a composure that impressed those who accompanied her. Witnesses wrote of her resilience, how she moved among her ladies with a kind of quiet steadiness, praying aloud when the waves grew rough, comforting those who wept. In this she revealed the same quality that would later define her survival in England, the ability to outlast storms by remaining still at the centre. When at last the sails caught the right wind and the cliffs of England rose like grey sentinels, her arrival became spectacle. Coastal towns decked their streets with banners, trumpets blared as ships pulled into harbour. For the people, a foreign queen was always a pageant, a chance to glimpse not just a woman, but the promise she carried: peace, heirs, stability. Crowds gathered along the quaysides, craning necks, waving kerchiefs, shouting blessings in a tongue Anne could not yet understand. Every cheer was weighted with expectation. For nobles and diplomats, those same cheers were ledger entries. Each banner hung across a guildhall was a signal to Europe. England was not adrift, it had bound itself again into continental affairs. Each flourish of ceremony was meant to reassure Protestant allies and warn Catholic enemies. The Spanish and imperial ambassadors watching closely scribbled reports back to Charles V and the Emperor's court, judging not the woman but the theatre of her reception. England wanted the world to see unity where in truth there was fracture. Anne herself moved through this carnival of symbols with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She saw the strange roofs of English houses, the banners painted with lions and roses, the men bowing low but eyeing her with curiosity. She must have wondered what they whispered to one another, whether they found her plain or fair, whether her modest German manners seemed out of place in this kingdom of pageantry. The journey that had begun in storms now delivered her into a storm of eyes. Her landing was not just a personal milestone but a diplomatic declaration. As she set foot on English soil, she carried with her the fragile hope of Protestant Europe Cromwell's career, Henry's prowess and the gaze of half a continent. She was 24 years old, walking into a marriage she had not chosen, in a land whose language she could not speak, surrounded by strangers who measured her every gesture as though it were a message from heaven or a threat from hell. In that moment, Anne of Cleves was both a bride and a cipher, her body the parchment on which treaties were written. The wind still smelled of salt, but now also of expectation. Behind her, the sea closed like a gate. Ahead, the road wound toward Rochester, where Henry, impatient and swollen with curiosity, prepared a greeting that would alter her fate before she even reached the altar. It should have been the stuff of romance, the kind of scene Henry VIII adored from the chivalric tales of his youth. At Rochester, as Anne of Cleves rested after her long punishing journey across the Channel, the king plotted a surprise. He would not come to her as monarch, but as gallant knight cloaked in disguise, eager to spark that instant recognition so beloved of medieval stories, the lady who sees through the mask, the destined glance that confirms love before vows are spoken. Henry had played this game before with other women, delighting in the theatre of courtly love. Now swollen with age and ambition, he attempted it again, hoping perhaps that life would imitate romance. He entered her chamber in borrowed clothes, masked in anonymity, expecting that Anne's eyes would light with sudden passion. But Anne of Cleves had been raised in a world where men did not ambush women with theatrics, where sober courtesy outweighed play acting. She saw only a stranger large, ruddy bearing flowers like an over-eager intruder. Startled, she bowed politely, thanked him with formal words, and returned to her embroidery. There was no flutter of delight, no spark of recognition, no breathless surrender to the fiction Henry cherished. The silence after that exchange must have burned hotter than any storm at sea. For Henry it was humiliation disguised as disappointment. He had imagined himself still the knight of his youth, capable of winning devotion by charm alone. Instead, he saw a woman unmoved, her gaze cool, her politeness unbroken. Where he had expected the script of romance, Anne delivered the script of discipline measured, reserved the product of a Lutheran household where frivolity was suspect. The gulf between cultures yawned wide. In Germany, courtliness meant modesty, obedience, a refusal to engage in dangerous flirtation. In England, courtliness was performance which traded like coin desire expressed in carefully staged play. Anne's response in its simplicity said nothing more than "I do not know you," but Henry heard in it a deeper insult, rejection. And rejection to a king already tormented by his failing body was intolerable. Psychologists today might call it projection. Henry, plagued by ulcers and impotence, carried within him the terror that he was no longer desirable, no longer a man in the ways that mattered most to him. When Anne failed to respond with the adoration he craved, he translated her composure into scorn. In that moment, his insecurities crystallized into suspicion. If she did not admire him on sight, then surely she could never stir his blood. From that instant, the marriage was poisoned. The politics of alliance might still demand vows, but the king's pride had already been bruised. Courtiers sensed it too. Rumours would later whisper that Anne's face disappointed him, that her figure failed to arouse him, that she smelled foreign, alien, wrong. Yet the seed of disdain had been planted not in her features, but in this failed mask at Rochester, where one man's fantasy clashed with another culture's decorum. Henry never forgave that imagined slight. Every gesture Anne made thereafter was filtered through the lens of that first misfire. Her smiles became awkwardness, her silences became coldness, her modesty became deficiency. What had begun as a misunderstanding hardened into a narrative that would haunt her entire reign. The mask meant to ignite romance had instead lit the fuse of humiliation, and Henry VIII was not a man who suffered humiliation quietly. The morning of January 6, 1540, dawned under a sky the colour of lead. London's streets slick with frost filled with the echo of trumpets and the shuffle of horses as the city dressed itself for spectacle. From the rooftops tapestries fluttered their gold thread, catching what little light broke through the clouds. Heralds proclaimed the union of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves as the dawn of a new era, a Protestant bond strong enough to steady England against the Catholic world. On the surface it was celebration, beneath it was dread. In the abbey, nobles pressed close, their silks rustling like restless leaves. Each gaze was sharpened, calculating what this marriage meant for their fortunes, their alliances, their survival. Foreign envoys watched more keenly still. For them, every hymn sung and every candle lit was a telegram across Europe. England was no longer isolated. Henry had reached into the heart of Protestant Germany and claimed a bride to prove it. The ceremony was solemn, the vows firm, but in the air there hung a chill that had little to do with the weather. The bride herself moved with timidity. Anne, dressed in rich cloth of gold jewels, heavy at her throat, bowed with that same quiet composure that had already failed to please her husband. To those who knew nothing of Rochester's debacle, she seemed dignified. To Henry, she seemed like a mirror reflecting his humiliation. His jaw clenched as he spoke the words of union. His voice strained as though each syllable were a chain tightening. The people cheered outside, but inside, among the watchful courtiers, the silence was more eloquent than the music. Yet the true theatre of a Tudor wedding did not end at the altar, it began in the bedchamber. That night after the feasting, Anne was escorted to her chamber by ladies who disrobed her, as was custom, leaving her in the linen shift of a bride. Henry, swollen with wine and expectation, was guided in with ritual solemnity. Outside the door, witnesses waited as they always did for signs that the union had been consummated. In this age, a marriage was not fully legal until the act was complete, and for a king, consummation was more than legality. It was legitimacy, proof that the body royal could still perform the work of dynasty. Imagine the silence in those corridors. Courtiers straining their ears, servants whispering the thick tapestries, muffling not only sound but anxiety. Time stretched. No jubilant cry, no sudden bustle of attendants. The king emerged at dawn, muttering excuses, complaining of weariness. He claimed he had touched his bride, but I liked her not. The words casual and damning spread like wildfire. What Henry whispered in confidence became the chorus of a court desperate to echo their master. From that first night, the marriage was already framed as failure. The king insisted Anne did not please him, that her body stirred no desire, that her very presence repelled him. Rumour, ever hungry, embroidered the tale with cruelty, that she smelled strange, that she was unformed, that she was too plain for a king. Few dared to mention the truth that Henry himself, crippled by ulcers, obesity, and the lingering injury from his jousting accident, may not have been capable of consummation at all. Better to scapegoat the foreign bride than expose the weakness of the monarch. In diplomatic terms, this was a disaster. Every foreign envoy knew that consummation was not just a private act but a public guarantee. If the marriage was not sealed in flesh, then the treaty with Cleves was fragile, vulnerable to annulment. Already whispers ran through the embassies: was the king impotent, or was the bride defective? Either answer carried danger. To admit the former was to weaken the crown before Europe. To declare the latter was to insult the very Protestant allies Henry needed. Thus the wedding day, proclaimed as triumph, soured into calamity almost overnight. The grey sky that had hung over London seemed an omen. Trumpets had announced the start of a new age, but in the bedchamber where dynasties were made or unmade, silence had fallen like a pall. For Anne, bewildered and obedient, it was the beginning of a union already treated as a corpse. For Henry, humiliated and furious, it was the birth of a grievance he would soon nurse into fury. A wedding that should have been salvation had the atmosphere of a funeral, and every player in the Tudor court could already smell decay on the air. Whispers are faster than fire in a Tudor palace. By the second night of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, the corridors already trembled with rumour. The king had confided to his closest men that he liked her. Not that she was no maiden in body, that some deformity, some strangeness made him recoil. The tale spread in fragments that she emitted an odour, that her breasts sagged, that her skin was coarser than Holbein's brush had promised. Each repetition sharpened the cruelty, turning speculation into certainty. Before long, the court was repeating it as gospel truth the king could not perform because the queen was unworthy. The irony was corrosive. Those same courtiers knew the condition of Henry's body better than anyone. They had seen him carried to council because his legs could no longer bear him. They smelled the sour reek of his ulcers when he shifted in his chair. They watched him sweat rivers under layers of velvet, the pain in his joints making him groan between words. And they knew the story of January 1536, when a jousting accident had left the king unconscious for 2 hours his leg smashed so badly that the wound never healed. From that day his vigour faltered. Physicians now suspect that accident damaged more than his leg, that it may have triggered systemic complications, metabolic collapse, even impotence. But the body of a king could never be allowed to appear weak. In the Tudor imagination, a monarch's virility was a metaphor for the state itself. To admit that Henry could not consummate a marriage was to admit that the kingdom's lifeblood was failing. It was safer, cleaner to shift the blame onto the foreign bride. Better to let Anne carry the mark of malformation than to expose the truth that the sovereign, once a stallion of Europe, was now hobbled and unsure of his manhood. Thus the gossip became armour. Henry himself encouraged it, repeating to trusted courtiers that though he had lain beside Anne, he felt no stirring that he could not be provoked. He described her body in words chosen to wound, muttering that her breasts were slack and her belly loose, as though she were not a maiden at all. He spoke of the supposed foulness of her skin, the strangeness of her person. These details, however grotesque, gave his failure an alibi. If the king could not desire her, then it was her fault, not his. Ambassadors ever alert recorded the contradictions. The French envoy reported slyly that perhaps the king's distaste was not for Anne alone, but for the state of his own flesh. Imperial spies whispered that the marriage was a sham, that the queen was being blamed for a problem no physician dared name. Yet even they hesitated to write plainly what everyone suspected. In a Europe where potency was equated with sovereignty, to declare Henry impotent was to invite rebellion and mockery. Silence served everyone except Anne. For her, the rumours were chains. She had no voice to defend herself, no language in which to protest. She did not understand that her husband's failures were being written onto her body like graffiti. She only knew that she was treated as defective, that laughter followed her down corridors, that the king's coldness was mirrored by the court's disdain. The alliance that was meant to shield England had been transformed into a cage of humiliation with Anne trapped inside. This pattern, protecting the myth of male power by sacrificing female dignity, is older than the Tudors and outlived them. In Henry's court it was a survival tactic. His ministers, his nobles, even his physicians understood that the king's pride was more dangerous than any truth. To expose his body as the source of failure was to risk ruin. To allow Anne's body to bear the blame was to preserve the illusion of strength. Thus, with every whisper of odour and malformation, the court conspired in a fiction that the king was still the stallion of Europe, and that it was only his queen who was broken. Behind the closed doors of Whitehall, the truth lay festering like Henry's wounds. But truth mattered less than performance. England could not afford to admit that its monarch was failing in body as well as in policy. And so Anne of Cleves became the scapegoat, her innocence transfigured into a mask of rejection, her body made into the alibi that allowed the kingdom's greatest secret to remain unspoken. Anne of Cleves entered Henry's court not as a queen enthroned, but as a curiosity set on display. Each day became a test she could not pass a theatre forward where courtiers sharpened their wit on her difference. Her German accent clung stubbornly to her English words, each mispronunciation echoing like a jest across the chamber. When she attempted the courtly dances, her steps were measured stiff out of time with the lutes and recorders that demanded grace. Where Henry's other queens had played the virginals, sung madrigals, or quoted French verse with Polish, Anne could offer only silence or the careful, modest replies drilled into her by a Lutheran upbringing. The court turned this silence into comedy. Her laughter, shy and delayed, was mimicked behind fans. Her appetite for hearty German dishes, sausages, dark bread, strong beer was whispered about as proof of rusticity. Even her gowns, though rich, seemed oddly plain beside the glittering styles imported from Italy or France. What in Cleves had been considered pious simplicity became in London a catalogue of deficiencies. She was not witty enough, not musical enough, not supple enough. Each of these knots gathered like stones, and soon she was carrying them as though they were part of her name. And then there was Catherine Howard. Barely 17, cousin to the executed Anne Boleyn, she moved through the court like quicksilver smiles, darting laughter, bubbling her youth and intoxicant to a king, desperate to feel his own virility once more. Catherine danced with the ease of someone born to charm. She sang, she flirted, she blushed at just the right moment. To Henry, wounded in body and pride, she was the antidote to humiliation. Where Anne's reserve reminded him of his failures, Catherine's lightness fed him the illusion that he could still inspire devotion, still command desire. The comparison was inevitable and devastating. Each time Catherine's laughter rang in a hall, Anne's silence deepened into shadow. Each time the king leaned toward the young girl's brightness, courtiers followed his gaze and learned their lesson. Flatter the new star, mock the eclipsed one. For Anne, every polite smile became a brick in the golden cage she inhabited. She could not protest. Obedience was her training. She could not flee. Queens did not resign. So she endured each day, piling humiliation upon humiliation, her life preserved, but her dignity gnawed away. What makes this cruelty more bitter is its subtlety. Anne was never struck, never screamed at in public, never threatened with steel. Instead, her torment was woven into the fabric of courtly life, the pause before laughter, the feigned sympathy that concealed mockery, the careful way courtiers avoided her in favour of Catherine's company. It was death by 1,000 gestures. In the glitter of Tudor masks and the sparkle of Catherine's youth, Anne was slowly erased, reduced to a foreign era paraded in silks. Henry's court was a place where power spoke through spectacle, and Anne had become the wrong kind of spectacle. Her very presence reminded the king of a bargain he regretted, a body he could not command, a policy turned sour. To protect himself, he let the stage turn against her, and the courtiers, ever alert to royal moods, were only too willing to join the performance. What began as mockery became ritual. Anne smiled through it all, not realizing that each smile meant as courtesy was interpreted as resignation. And so the cage closed one golden bar at a time. Ambassadorial dispatches flew from England like startled birds, each one carrying a slightly different version of the same uneasy song. From London to Paris, Brussels, and the courts of the empire, secretaries folded the latest rumours into ciphered letters. The king does not love his new queen. The marriage is not consummated. There is talk whispered then written that it may be dissolved. In an age for newspapers, these dispatches were Europe's nervous system. A single phrase in a letter could shift alliances, rattle markets, or send troops marching. The French envoys wrote with sly satisfaction. They had always doubted the match with Cleves, and now they watched Henry's humiliation as a kind of revenge. Their reports to Francois Vlll described a king grievously displeased with his bride, hinting that England's isolation was deepening, that perhaps France could play the Protestant card more profitably. Imperial agents, for their part, reported back to Charles V with a mixture of schadenfreude and caution. They delighted in Henry's discomfort, Catherine of Aragon's nephew avenged at last, but they also noted the dangerous precedent. If the King of England could discard a bride so easily, what was the value of any treaty sealed by marriage? Inside Whitehall, these rumours were not distant thunder, but an approaching storm. Each dispatch landing in a foreign chancery was a pinprick to England's credibility. For Cromwell, the architect of the alliance, they were knives turning in his gut. He read copies of ambassadorial reports smuggled back to him and saw his own reputation unravelling line by line. The marriage had been his masterstroke, the keystone of his Protestant strategy. Now it threatened to become his epitaph. The stakes were staggering. If Henry admitted impotence, the crown's myth of virility cracked open. Europe would see not a virile monarch defying Rome, but a sick aging man whose body had betrayed him. Such an admission would embolden Catholic powers, frighten Protestant allies, and perhaps spark rebellion at home. But to invent a legal nullity claiming the marriage invalid for reasons of pre-contract deception or lack of true consent meant insulting Cleves, undermining the Protestant alliance Cromwell had so carefully cultivated. Either route risked making England a pariah. Cromwell stood in the middle of this dilemma, a man who had climbed from the smithy of Putney to the Council of Kings. He had outmanoeuvred nobles, dismantled monasteries, reshaped the state, but he had never faced a problem like this. A king whose pride was both the engine and the obstacle of policy. To preserve Henry's dignity, Cromwell would have to sacrifice his own strategy. To preserve his strategy, he would have to risk at Henry's rage. The ambassadors, meanwhile, kept scribbling. One French observer noted that the king is much displeased and taketh counsel how he may be delivered. Another reported that Madame de Cleves hath comported herself with great humility, a polite way of saying she was blameless but doomed. In Brussels, Charles V's men speculated on whether England might crawl back to the Catholic fold. In the Empire, Protestant princes wondered if Henry's coldness to Anne signalled coldness to them. Every rumour, every cipher tightened the net. The foreign world was watching not a private marriage but a public test of Henry's body, his will, and his government's credibility. Inside the palace, the courtiers sensed blood in the water, and began to edge away from Cromwell, whispering that the blacksmith's son had overreached. The very alliance he had forged to protect himself now became the blade curling toward his neck. In such a court perception was everything. A rumour repeated often enough became precedent. A precedent dressed in legal robes became verdict. Cromwell had built a career turning paperwork into power. Now, paperwork dispatches, reports, petitions was turning into a noose. And as each ambassador sealed his letter and pressed his signet ring into wax, the world beyond England sharpened its knives, waiting to see whether this island kingdom and its ailing king could survive a blunder of their own making. By the summer of 1540, the farce had swollen into a crisis that could no longer be hidden. England's ministers, judges and churchmen convened like actors preparing for a play whose ending was already scripted. The king had made his displeasure clear. Anne of Cleves must no longer be queen. The task now was to unmake the marriage without unmaking the crown's dignity. Councils were called in haste. Legal minds rummaged through precedents like scavengers in a midden, searching for arguments that could make the impossible possible. A marriage witnessed, celebrated and crowned had to be undone, without admitting the one truth no one dared to utter, that the king's body had failed him. And so they began to retrofit excuses. The first pillar was pre-contract. Anne, it was argued, had once been betrothed to Francis of Lorraine, a match abandoned but never formally dissolved. That ghost of a promise, they claimed, still lingered enough to taint her vows with Henry. The second pillar was non-consummation. Witnesses swore the king had confessed his aversion, that he had lain beside her, but had not the will. Doctors and matrons were summoned to speculate in tones both solemn and absurd on the queen's virginity and the king's inability to be stirred. The third pillar was deceit. Henry himself fanned the claim that he had been tricked by Holbein's portrait, that the woman before him bore little resemblance to the painted image that had sealed the treaty. It was theatre more than trial, a courtroom mask. No one dared to mention the ulcers that suppurated on Henry's legs, the obesity that left him gasping, the jousting accident that had likely ruined his capacity for desire. The king was to remain in official record unimpeachably virile. If the marriage failed, it was because Anne had been flawed, or fate had been meddled with, or portraits had lied. The body of the king was sacred. Only the queen could be sacrificed. And Anne, what of her? She was summoned bewildered by the swirl of legal Latin and hostile stares. She understood little of the language, but she understood everything of the danger. The scaffold was never far from a Tudor queen. Anne Boleyn's ghost walked those chambers headless but eloquent. To resist Henry, to insist upon her rights as wife and queen, was to gamble with her neck. To yield, to accept humiliation in sentence, was to live. Her choice was swift and in its own way magnificent. She agreed to the annulment. She wrote, or rather signed, letters of consent declaring herself unworthy, thanking the king for his generosity, relinquishing the crown without protest. Some later called it cowardice, but it was something harder, a steel-spined calculation of survival. Anne of Cleves knew she could not outwit Henry, but she could outlast him. She would keep her body intact even if her dignity was bartered away. On July the 9th, 1540, Parliament declared the marriage null and void. The news crackled through London like a fire. Commoners muttered that the Queen had been returned as one returns faulty cloth to a merchant. Foreign ambassadors scribbled in disbelief. For them it was a grotesque comedy. England had trumpeted an alliance, celebrated a royal wedding, and within 6 months proclaimed it a mistake. But in that spectacle, Anne had accomplished something rare for a Tudor wife. She had preserved her life. She had looked at the sharpened machinery of annulment, the doctors, the bishops, the lawyers, dressing lies in robes, and chosen the one path that allowed her to keep walking. She would no longer be queen, but she would be alive with lands, with income, with the strange new title sister of the king. In a court where so many women were devoured by pride, passion, or principle, Anne's quiet surrender was not weakness, it was strategy. She had endured storms at sea, humiliation at court, and the king's contempt. Now she endured annulment with the same calm. She bent, but she did not break, and in bending she survived. On the morning of July 28, 1540, London awoke to the sound of bells, but they were not all ringing for the same purpose. To the west, church towers pealed in jubilation, announcing the king's marriage to Catherine Howard, the young, radiant niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk. To the east, a darker toll resounded, no bells, only the heavy tread of guards and the murmur of a crowd gathered at Tower Hill, where Thomas Cromwell, once the king's most trusted architect of policy, was led to the scaffold. 2 ceremonies, 2 theatres, 1 city, the obscene symmetry of Tudor power. Cromwell mounted the platform with the composure of a man who had long known this day was coming. His enemies had sharpened their knives for years, resentful that a blacksmith's son could wield more power than dukes. Now with the Cleves marriage undone, Henry himself had abandoned him, throwing the architect of his Protestant strategy to the wolves as the executioner raised his axe. Cromwell prayed aloud, his voice trembling, then steadying before the blade fell and severed the head that had once guided England through its break with Rome. At that very moment, only a few miles away, silken ribbons fluttered from windows as Catherine Howard was paraded as the king's new bride. She was barely out of girlhood, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of triumph, her youth a balm to Henry's wounded pride. For the courtiers, her marriage was a carnival, music, wine, masks, and whispered bets on how long her star would shine. Where Cromwell's fall had been spectacle of blood, Catherine's wedding was spectacle of joy, two halves of the same coin life offered up to preserve the illusion of royal potency. This juxtaposition was no accident of timing, it was choreography. Henry wanted the world to forget Cromwell's disgrace the moment Catherine's beauty appeared beside him. He wanted the axeman's work to be drowned out by wedding hymns. He wanted England and Europe alike to see not a king crippled by failure, but a monarch who could discard a minister and a wife in one stroke, then crown another girl before the blood had dried. Tudor governance thrived on such theatre, the image protected, the truth executed. Yet Londoners, keen observers of irony, could not miss the grotesque rhythm of the day. They muttered that while bells rang for love, blood ran for policy, that the king who claimed to defend honour had abandoned his most loyal servant and humiliated a blameless woman to soothe his own vanity, that one marriage had lasted 6 months and another might last no longer. These were dangerous whispers spoken only in taverns or behind shutters, but they captured the sense that the kingdom was ruled by caprice rather than justice. For Anne of Cleves, now displaced but alive, the double ceremony was a warning and a gift. She had surrendered at the right moment, avoided Cromwell's fate, and stepped aside as Catherine Howard glittered briefly in the sunlight. She was no longer queen, but she was breathing. In a world where survival often came wrapped in humiliation, that counted as victory. The two bells of July 28th still echo as one of the starkest lessons of Henry's reign. A wedding and an execution, a bride crowned, and a servant beheaded, joy and terror entwined in the same morning. In that dissonant chorus, the Tudor state revealed its essence, not stability but spectacle, not truth but the ruthless preservation of image, and behind it all a king who believed that if the bells rang loudly enough, perhaps no one would hear the sound of the axe. Anne of Cleves did not leave the stage in disgrace but in paradox. When the annulment was pronounced, she was not sent home across the sea like a parcel returned, nor cast into a convent like some inconvenient widow. Instead, Henry offered her something no Queen of England had ever been given, a settlement that transformed her into a permanent resident of the realm. Not wife, not exile, but something in between, the king's sister. The title was a careful invention, both balm and brand. It gave Anne precedence at court, second only to Henry's daughters Mary and Elizabeth, and to his new bride. She was to be honoured at feasts, given place of dignity, and processions treated as kin. But the words also carried a sting. She was sister, not queen, a woman stripped of conjugal power, bound to the crown but denied its crown. It was as much a reminder of failure as it was an assurance of safety. The generosity, however, was immense. She was granted a household befitting royalty, an income of £3,000 or £4,000 a year, enough to maintain estates and servants with comfort. She received Richmond Palace on the Thames, once a residence of kings and Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn, as if fate enjoyed cruel symmetry. These estates gave her both status and independence. She could host, she could patronise, she could rule her small world without waiting on Henry's favour for every coin. But survival within this arrangement required exquisite balance. Anne could never be too visible lest her presence remind Henry of the marriage he regretted. She could never appear ungrateful lest she be accused of insolence. She had to accept gifts with humility, but not abasement, attend court with deference, but not ambition, smile at Catherine Howard without bitterness, dine with Mary and Elizabeth without favouring one over the other, gratitude without grovelling, presence without due to power. It was a performance as delicate as any mask she had failed to master, and yet Anne managed it with a composure that astonished those who knew her. When she first addressed Henry after the annulment, she reportedly thanked him for his kindness, assuring him she was content to be treated as his sister. Whether those words were sincere or spoken through clenched dignity, they saved her. By choosing silence where others might have protested by bending rather than breaking, Anne carved out a place for herself that no axe could touch. The irony was sharp. In relinquishing her title as queen, she gained a kind of freedom unknown to Henry's other wives. She had wealth without the nightly summons to a bed she did not desire. She had honour without the constant scrutiny of fertility. She had safety in a court where safety was rare. To some this seemed fortune. To Anne it was a narrow path through thorns lined with constant reminders of what had been lost. Every time she signed her name as the king's sister, the paradox whispered back, a woman exalted for having surrendered, honoured for being rejected, enshrined in comfort, yet locked outside the gates of true power. But in a world where queens so often lost their heads, Anne's compromise was its own form of victory. The crown had been denied her, yet in its place she was granted something rarer, the right to live. Anne of Cleves might have been stripped of her crown, but she was not stripped of her dignity. From the moment she accepted her new identity as the king's sister, she began the patient work of building a life in the margins, neither at the centre of power nor outside of it. She did what few queens in Tudor history ever managed. She transformed humiliation into stability. Her estates became her stage. At Richmond and later at Hever, Anne organised her own household with a quiet efficiency that reflected her German upbringing. She oversaw accounts with care, ensuring that rents were collected, debts paid, and servants maintained with fairness. Surviving ledgers show her purchases of silks and jewels, but also of simpler items, tapestries, linens, garden tools. There was no waste, no extravagance that could provoke gossip. Her domestic management impressed even seasoned English stewards. She was a woman who knew how to keep order in a world built on disorder. Gradually, she acquired the language of her adopted country. Her English was never flawless, but she grew confident enough to converse with neighbours and courtiers, to follow sermons, to participate in the rituals of her new land. The very effort softened her foreignness. Where once her accent was mocked, now it was regarded with a kind of indulgent affection. People began to call her, not the Flanders mare as Henry had once cruelly nicknamed her, but Our Lady of Richmond, a sign that she had turned from outsider into fixture. Her relationships with the king's children gave her life an even sturdier foundation. With Princess Mary devout and serious, she shared a bond of discretion. Mary valued Anne's piety and her refusal to involve herself in court intrigues. With Elizabeth quick-tongued and observant, Anne cultivated a warmer tie, more like an elder sister than a rival. She gifted the girl dresses and books, tokens that Elizabeth treasured in her difficult youth. Even Prince Edward, the fragile hope of the dynasty, was presented to Anne as if she were his aunt. She accepted the role gracefully, never overstepping, never appearing ambitious. That very modesty made her safe, and safety made her indispensable. Anne's patronage extended beyond the royal family. She gave alms to the poor, financed small repairs to parish churches near her estates, and supported widows in her service. These gestures, modest by royal standards, built her a reputation among ordinary people as a benevolent figure, quiet, approachable, untainted by scandal. In a kingdom weary of executions and court dramas, this reputation was gold. Feast days at her houses became small rituals of goodwill. She hosted neighbours' celebrated saints' days with modest music and shared tables blending German customs with English ones. Her retainers praised her fairness, her ability to listen, her calm in judgment. Where the court was a place of whispers and betrayals, Anne's households became refuges of predictability. She had turned the art of survival into a kind of statecraft, not through power plays, but through steadiness. This was her genius. She chose neutrality as her weapon. In an age when every faction at court sought to ensnare her, Catholic or Protestant, conservative or reformist, Anne refused to be bait. She signed no manifestos, championed no causes, whispered in no ears. By doing nothing, she did everything. She became paradoxically the one woman at Henry's court who could not be accused of scheming. That made her valuable. That made her safe. In the margins where others saw exile, Anne built a sanctuary. She turned her loss into space, her silence into shield. While Catherine Howard danced toward disaster and Catherine Parr prepared to navigate the perils of Henry's final years, Anne tended gardens, spoke with children, balanced accounts, and gave bread to the poor. It was a life without glory, but it was a life, and in Tudor England, where queens so often paid with blood, that was triumph enough. The bells that had once rung for Catherine Howard's wedding tolled again in 1542, this time to summon the people of London to witness her downfall. Barely 3 years after she had displaced Anne of Cleves, the young queen was led to the scaffold on Tower Green, accused of adultery and treason. She was no older than 20. The same courtiers who had once praised her laughter now whispered prayers as the axe fell. In Tudor England, fortune's wheel turned with merciless speed. For Anne, the news arrived at Richmond like the echo of a warning she had already heeded. Some whispered that perhaps she would be recalled restored as queen to fill the void Catherine's death had left. But Henry would not reopen that wound. The memory of his humiliation at Rochester of the failed marriage bed was too raw. He preferred to grant Anne her safety at a distance rather than risk his pride again. Instead, Catherine Parr, witty, pious, and politically astute, would eventually take the role of sixth queen. Anne remained the king's sister, a title that had become both shield and exile. In this refusal lay a telling contrast. While queens came and went executed or exhausted by childbirth, Anne remained alive, steady, untouchable. She was no longer the woman mocked for her accent and her plainness, but the woman who had survived. She had outlasted Catherine Howard's charm, outlasted Jane Seymour's sacrifice, outlasted the fury that had destroyed Anne Boleyn. It was not beauty or brilliance that saved her, but the discipline of survival. Meanwhile, the king who had spurned her was rotting from within. By the 1540s, Henry's body had become a fortress, crumbling behind its walls. His ulcers drained constantly. Attendants described the sickly smell that clung to him wherever he went. His waistline expanded until special devices had to hoist him into the saddle. He shuffled more than he walked, his temper growing shorter as his breath grew shallower. Paranoia settled over the court like a fog. Spies whispered in chambers, nobles second-guessed every gesture, factions sharpened knives in anticipation of a succession that looked increasingly uncertain. In this decaying world, Anne's life stood in striking relief. Her health remained robust. She walked in her gardens, rode in her carriages, hosted modest feasts. Her complexion was said to glow with the vigour of someone unburdened by the king's bed or the poison of politics. Servants adored her fairness. Neighbours spoke kindly of her generosity. She was in her quiet way. Everything Henry's court was not stable, measured, humane. The contrast did not go unnoticed. Chroniclers later remarked on how Anne seemed to flourish in the margins while Henry withered at the centre. In some sense, she became a living reminder of what might have been had the king valued peace over vanity, steadiness over spectacle. Yet she never pressed this point, never sought to exploit the king's weakness. Her survival depended on restraint, and so she watched silently as Catherine Howard's tragedy played out, understanding that the scaffold's shadow had brushed close to her once, and could again if she forgot her role. In those years, Anne's greatest triumph was invisibility. She was present enough to maintain her honour, but distant enough to avoid envy. She smiled when summoned, offered courtesy to the king's new wife, and then withdrew again into her world of ordered accounts and quiet gardens. Henry's court was a furnace that consumed women. Anne had stepped aside and refused to burn, and as Catherine Howard's body was laid to rest, Anne of Cleves lived on serene in the knowledge that silence had been her most unassailable ally. For Anne of Cleves, the late 1540s unfolded like a long, steady exhale after years of storms. She had learned the delicate art of surviving at court by living just outside of it, close enough to honour her strange role as the king's sister, but distant enough to let daggers pass her by. At Richmond and Hever, her days took on a rhythm of gardens and prayer of letters, exchanged with her German kin of household accounts, balanced with meticulous care. The air around her was calmer scented, not with the foul draughts of Whitehall, but with rosemary and lavender from her own plots. She sent gifts as gestures of loyalty, jewels for Elizabeth devotional books for Mary, embroidered cloth for the infant Edward. These tokens were not extravagant, but thoughtful, designed to bind her to the Tudor children without entangling her in factional plots. The Seymour uncles who dominated the young Edward's regency courted her goodwill. So too did conservatives who thought she might lean toward Mary's piety. Anne gave each side what they wanted: a smile, a gift, a polite refusal to commit. Her neutrality was not ignorance but strategy, a survival learned through bitter experience. When Henry died in January 1547, bloated and broken, Anne was 41. She had outlived her marriage, her annulment, and her humiliation. Now she stood on the threshold of a new reign. For a moment she might have feared the loss of her protector's favour would strip her of lands and title. But Edward VI, though a boy of 9, was Protestant to the bone. His council recognised the value of keeping Anne content, for she still symbolised that Protestant alliance his father had once sought. Her incomes were confirmed, her status preserved. She remained a presence, if not a power. Edward's reign was turbulent, dominated by reforming zeal and the ambitions of his guardians, but Anne, seasoned by years of humiliation and retreat, knew better than to wade into theological wars. She kept her devotions private, her sympathies broad, her household a refuge rather than a camp. While the kingdom argued over altars and vestments, she tended roses and orchards. While London's pulpits thundered with doctrine, her halls echoed with music and laughter in moderation. For the first time since leaving Dusseldorf, Anne enjoyed a peace unmarred by constant fear. That peace was interrupted when Edward's health collapsed, and Mary Tudor, eldest daughter of Catherine of Aragon, claimed the crown in 1553. London, which had once celebrated Anne's arrival as queen, now prepared another triumph. Mary's entry into the city was a river of pageantry banners, rippling trumpets, blaring citizens, strewing flowers before her horse. Anne attended her presence a reminder of continuity. She had once been paraded through the streets as Henry's salvation. Now she watched another woman hailed as England's deliverer. The cheers were not for her, but she understood the language of spectacle well enough to stand within it without envy. At Mary's coronation pageant in Westminster, Anne was granted precedence as the king's sister. She sat in her place of honour, her German reserve wrapped in English silks, a figure who had once been mocked as foreign, now absorbed into the fabric of the realm. For a fleeting moment she was again part of the great machinery of Tudor display, her survival dressed in velvet and jewels. And yet unlike Mary, unlike Henry, unlike the queens who had gone before her, Anne knew that when the trumpets faded, she would return to her gardens and her ledgers, her safety intact. In these years, Anne perfected the art of being indispensable by being inoffensive. She was a companion when summoned a hostess, when visited a benefactress to the poor, and always someone who never reached too far. She had lived long enough to see crowns glitter and full heads rise and roll, and now she inhaled the sweet air of survival, and when she exhaled it was in laughter with her ladies, in the quiet scratching of her pen across parchment, in the rustle of wind through her orchards. The kingdom shifted and reeled, but Anne of Cleves endured a reminder that sometimes the strongest throne is a garden bench in the sun. Under Mary Tudor's reign, Anne of Cleves passed into the twilight of her life with the same careful restraint that had preserved her for nearly 2 decades. At first she enjoyed the warmth of ceremonial presence. Her precedence as the king's sister was confirmed at Mary's coronation, where she rode in state and was saluted by crowds who remembered her more kindly than they had at her wedding. But as Mary's reign deepened, so too did the shadows of suspicion. The Queen, fiercely Catholic and wary of Protestant sympathisers, kept Anne at a polite but cooling distance. Anne's settlement remained intact. Her annual income continued, her estates were managed, but she was rarely summoned to court. Some whispered that Mary doubted her loyalty, seeing in her Protestant brother Wilhelm of Cleves a potential source of intrigue. Yet Anne refused to be bait. She did not host factions, did not court foreign envoys, did not align herself with any conspirators. She knew better than to play in the lethal game of religion that was tearing England apart. Instead, she remained within the rhythm she had cultivated: modest feasts, charitable donations, careful accounts. Her household changed with time. Some of her German ladies returned home. English retainers filled their place. She developed a reputation for prudence, balancing generosity with discipline. Neighbours near Hever and Richmond remembered her as a fair mistress, one who rewarded service faithfully and punished rarely. Her letters from this period are few, but those that survive suggest a woman content with her gardens, her reading, and her small circle of trusted attendants. She had slipped from the tempest of politics into a quiet harbour, and there she chose to stay. By the mid-1550s, Anne's health began to falter. Chroniclers note no specific illness of Monsieur d'Ebers, perhaps a slow wasting, perhaps the toll of age, but by 1557 she was visibly weakened. She withdrew to her residence at Chelsea, where her household ministered to her with loyalty. There were no grand final intrigues, no deathbed dramas, only the slow dimming of a life that had once been the centre of Europe's gaze. In July 1557, Anne of Cleves died quietly in her 52nd year. She was the last surviving wife of Henry VIII, the only one to be laid to rest, not in exile or disgrace, but in the soil of her adopted kingdom. Her body was borne to Westminster Abbey, a rare honour for a foreign-born queen consort, yet, even in death, her placement spoke of paradox. She was interred in a modest tomb set apart from the grand shrines of kings and saints, her monument tucked near the choir, dignified but discreet. Visitors walking the nave often overlooked it, as though her fate in life had followed her into eternity present, but marginal, honoured but understated, and yet her burial at Westminster mattered. It was England's recognition that she belonged, that the woman once mocked and discarded had become part of the kingdom's memory, not by glory, nor by scandal, nor by martyrdom, but by endurance. Anne of Cleves ended her days not as queen, not as wife, but as survivor, her name carved into stone in the nation's most sacred ground. her story a quiet echo beneath vaulted arches. History has given Anne of Cleves a curious epithet, the lucky one. It is true she escaped the scaffold that claimed Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. She did not wither in exile like Catherine of Aragon, nor vanish in childbirth like Jane Seymour. She lived on comfortably housed, generously endowed, secure in her position as the king's sister. By the brutal arithmetic of Tudor queenship, this counted as fortune. Yet luck is a word that can bruise as much as it blesses. For what did that luck entail? Anne never wore the crown that was promised to her. She never bore children the currency of dynasties. She endured humiliation as the scapegoat of a king's failure, her body dissected by rumour, her dignity traded for survival. Every laugh at her accent, every whisper about her supposed odour, every sideways glance in the court was the price she paid for keeping her head. Survival, yes, but survival scarred. Still, there is another way to measure her fate. Consider Henry's tomb. The king who had mocked her as unlovable was buried in Windsor's St. George's Chapel amid stone pomp, but his body decayed into legend as grotesque as his reign, the bloated corpse, the ulcers, the cruelty remembered more vividly than his glories. His legacy is heavy with rot, political, physical, moral. Anne, by contrast, rests quietly in Westminster Abbey. Her monument is modest, easily missed, but clean. No tales of tyranny cling to her name. Instead, she is remembered for her prudence, her good humour in later years, her kindness to the king's children, her quiet charity to the poor. While Henry's afterlife became a cautionary tale of power consumed by vanity, Anne's became a study in competence and endurance. She was not dazzling, not dramatic. She did not dance her way into poetry or die her way into legend. She endured, and in enduring she outlasted. If Henry's tomb proclaims grandeur and echoes with decay, Anne's whispers of balanced discretion and a certain unexpected peace. To call her lucky is both true and unfair. She was lucky in that she survived, but she was not spared pain. Her luck was not the windfall of fortune, but the careful art of choosing silence over defiance, composure over protest, patience over pride. It was the kind of luck a woman had to manufacture for herself in a world designed to break her. Perhaps that is the truest legacy. Anne of Cleves showed that survival itself could be a form of power, quiet, unflaunted, but enduring. She carved a space where none should have existed, a life in which she was neither queen nor exile, but something stranger and more resilient. She left no dynasty, but she left a story, one that reminds us that in the blood-soaked theatre of the Tudors, sometimes the most radical triumph was simply to live, and to live with grace. The story of Anne of Cleves is not only about one woman and her failed marriage, but about the larger mask that power wears and the cost to those forced to live beneath it. Henry needed the image of potency, the virile king, master of alliances, breaker of Rome's chains. He could not confess his own body's betrayal, so he remade Anne into the problem. Her plainness, her silence, her foreign manners became the camouflage for his wounds. In this way, the most private corner of life, the marriage bed, was transformed into a battlefield of politics where a woman's dignity was the casualty sacrificed to preserve a man's pride. Anne's portrait by Holbein promised serenity, modesty, alliance. But the canvas was never the woman. It was a mirror for Henry's fantasy, and when the real Anne did not conform, the illusion shattered. Here lies the quiet lesson: images are fragile, and the truth they conceal has a way of seeping out. A king could command armies, silence parliaments, and send wives to the scaffold, but he could not command desire where his own body failed. Power's greatest weakness is always the truth it cannot confess. And yet amid this cruelty, Anne herself becomes luminous. She was no rebel, no martyr. She did not raise a banner or hurl accusations. Her strength was gentleness, her defiance was survival. By surrendering her crown, she chose life. By refusing to be baited into factional intrigue, she preserved her safety. By cultivating gardens, friendships, and charity, she turned her exile into a refuge. Where others were destroyed by Henry's wrath, Anne endured not because she was lucky, but because she was wise. Her story forces us to reconsider what power looks like. Is it the crown on Henry's coffin, bloated with ceremony, but rotting in memory? Or is it the modest tomb in Westminster where a foreign bride rests quietly, remembered not for scandal, but for prudence and endurance? History often celebrates noise, the wars, the executions, the decrees shouted from thrones. But sometimes the truer strength lies in silence, in the refusal to be consumed by the flames that destroyed others. Perhaps that is why Anne of Cleves, once derided, as the Mayor of Flanders, remains an unsettling figure. She does not fit the tragic mould of the Tudor queens nor the triumphant one. She is something harder to categorise, a survivor who turned humiliation into strategy, who accepted less in order to keep more. In a court built on spectacle, she found her power in absence. And so we return to the question that lingers under the stone vaults of Westminster: what does it mean to be fortunate? Is it to wear the crown to dazzle in the pageant, even if the end is death? Or is it to walk away from the throne scarred but breathing, and to build a quieter kingdom in gardens and ledgers? What do you think? Was Anne of Cleves truly the lucky one, or was her survival another kind of burden? The story of Anne of Cleves, the so-called lucky wife of Henry VIII, reaches beyond the boundaries of Tudor England and touches something universal in the human experience. On the surface, her tale looks simple. She married a king, endured humiliation, and lived to tell the tale while other queens died on the scaffold. But beneath that outline lies a set of lessons that speak not only to the politics of the 16th century, but to the choices we face in our own lives today. The first lesson is that survival can be its own form of courage. Anne is sometimes dismissed as passive, as though her quiet acceptance of annulment was weakness. Yet her decision to yield rather than resist was made in the shadow of the executioner's block. To live when pride demanded defiance required immense discipline. In a world that prized noise, she chose silence. In a court that demanded spectacle, she embraced invisibility. That choice preserved her life, and with it her ability to create a modest but meaningful legacy. In our lives too, there are times when strength lies not in confrontation but in restraint. The wisdom to discern when to stand tall and when to step aside is no less heroic than bold defiance. The second lesson is the danger of illusion. Henry VIII was undone not by Anne's supposed plainness, but by his own insistence on preserving the myth of virility. He could not admit weakness, so he forced others to carry the burden of his failures. The court became a theatre where women's reputations were destroyed to protect a fragile image. This reveals a truth still relevant: when pride prevents us from acknowledging reality, we often inflict harm on those around us. Learning to face truth with humility, whether about our health, our limitations, or our mistakes, is a safeguard against cruelty. Power without honesty corrodes not only the powerful, but everyone within their reach. The third lesson lies in Anne's way of turning margins into sanctuary. Though denied the throne, she built a household that became a haven, orderly, charitable, and humane. She cultivated ties with Henry's children, offered alms to the poor, and hosted modest feasts that bound her to local communities. Where others might have seen exile, she found independence. This is a reminder that even when life does not give us the stage we imagined, we can still make meaning in smaller spaces. A life of gardens, kindness, and measured choices may lack grandeur, but it is no less worthy than one marked by crowns and banners. Finally, Anne's story asks us to reconsider what luck really means. To some, her fortune was simply keeping her head, but in truth her luck was self-fashioned prudence, patience, and the refusal to be baited into destruction. We may not face Tudor palaces or royal marriages, but we all encounter situations where dignity and survival hang in the balance. Anne reminds us that gentleness can be strategy, survival can be defiance, and humility can carry its own quiet triumph. In the end, her modest tomb in Westminster Abbey may lack such splendour, but it holds a greater power, the testimony of a woman who endured without bitterness. Her life teaches us that sometimes the strongest victory is not conquest, but the choice to live wisely, quietly, and well. And so the question lingers for us today: when faced with humiliation or hardship, will we cling to pride and risk destruction, or like Anne choose the quieter path of survival that in time proves to be the greater strength? Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.